Hello, and welcome to the 50th episode of Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. When this program began in 2021, we were in the depths of the COVID-19 pandemic, isolating at home as modern cities witnessed the use of freezer trucks outside of hospitals for the dead and mass graves for temporary burials. Theaters and public venues were closed, and institutions like our sponsor, the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, were looking for ways to continue their missions, presenting culture to the public, but without having everyone in the same room breathing the same air. My good friend and colleague, Bartek Remisko, head of literature and the humanities at the Institute, asked if I might be interested in giving a series of maybe video lectures, like the talks I used to give at the New York Public Library or the classes I used to teach at Barnard College, Columbia University, and other institutions. And I suggested that maybe I could have conversations with my academic colleagues, literary translators, and eventually writers about Polish literature, past and present. We didn't know how well it would work out or how long it would last, but we got approval for the first 4 episodes and gave it a go, inventing the format on the fly. Now, about a year later, when Russia brutally invaded Ukraine, the Institute, following the directive of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, asked if we might be able to turn some of our attention toward Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian topics in Polish literature. And I said, well, it's not exactly my field. But of course, we wanted to do whatever we could to support the cause of democracy in Europe, which is always what has been at stake in Ukraine. So we began adding additional episodes on Ukrainian topics to the episodes that were already approved. And we are continuing to cover those topics in addition to our regularly scheduled material. As we've settled in, we've continuously upgraded our equipment, our look, and our sound. Natalia Iudin, my fellow producer and editor, designed a graphic theme for the show, and we added opening and closing music by composer and sound designer Radek Przedpełski from his work inspired by artist and writer Bruno Schulz. Above all, we thank you, our viewers, for maintaining your interest in watching the program. We thank all the professors who recommend or assign episodes of the program in their classes, and all of you who have subscribed to the Polish Cultural Institute New York's YouTube channel to get the program as soon as it's posted, even before the Institute's announcements go out. The channel had about 80 subscribers in its 3rd year when the program got started. And today it has over 1,500 subscribers, which isn't exactly winning the internet, but it's doing extraordinarily well for a program in English about Polish literature. Today, we'll be discussing the 2 most famous works of the Polish Renaissance poet Jan Kochanowski, who lived from 1530 to 1584 and is considered by some to be the greatest Slavic poet of his era. The Polish Renaissance represented a flourishing of culture in independent Poland, primarily in the 16th century reign of Zygmunt I and his queen, Bona Sforza of Italy. This was the era of the cosmopolitan culture of Latin, disseminated throughout Europe by the Catholic Church, which meant that Polish writers could exist on a relatively equal footing with poets and writers from anywhere in Europe. Education was largely clerical, so poets could study in Padua and Bologna and might serve in the Vatican. They read the same rhetorical manuals and classical sources as writers did across the continent, and they could be understood in the universal language of Latin by educated people without need for translation. The Latin poets brought classical form and versification that would later be adapted by vernacular poets writing in Polish, first introducing syllabic verse, in which lines followed a regular pattern of syllables, and the beginnings of syllabitonic verse, in which poetic lines might use regular numbers of syllables and regular stress patterns, as well as all the rhetorical devices or turns of phrase that were available to the classical poets. We're not going to have time today to look at all the Latin writers of the Renaissance in Poland, but I'd like to point out a recent translation by Frederick J. Booth of Mikołaj Hussowczyk's Song of the Size, the Ferocity, and the Hunting of Bison, which is an extended descriptive poem about nature in Poland, which is quite an unusual thing to find existed in 1523. Hussowczyk, or Nicholas Hussovianus, as he was known in Latin, was part of a delegation to the Vatican led by Erasm Choek, Bishop of Płock, and a poet himself. And he wrote the poem in the years 1521 to 22 at the request of Pope Leo X, Giovanni de' Medici, who had an interest in hunting. And bison did not exist anywhere in Europe at that time, except in the Polish and Baltic forests. So Hussovianus is sometimes claimed as well by Belarus and Lithuania. After all, he wrote in Latin, not in Polish. Modest in his presentation, he states that he is writing from experience more than drawing on classical references, though it is clear that he is aware of classical myth and the natural history of Pliny the Elder. Booth notes several comparisons to Catullus, Ovid, Virgil, and other classical writers. The poem is rich in metaphor, making an argument against violence and war by comparison to hunting, perhaps leveling some indirect criticism at Leo X's hunting practices, and alluding to conflict with the Prussians, but he still makes the case for Poland as the last bastion of Christianity against the Ottomans. After all, he knows his audience. In one of the poem's most moving passages, he describes a hunt set up as a spectacle for the court of King Alexander Jagiellończyk, Zygmunt I's elder brother, at which the men of Alexander's entourage would impress the queen and her ladies in waiting, who were observing from reviewing stands. How this worked, I don't know, but I suppose that in the 16th century they hunted that way. The nature of the poem The narrator of the poem, I should say, challenges Cupid, who shoots his arrows to rouse the hunters, asking, "What have you got to do with the woods, pernicious boy? Look how the young man whom you compel to compete to please a girl will die a sudden and foolish death at the hands of the ferocious bison." One of the bison, near death and indignant at this kind of display, charges the reviewing stand, nearly causing it to topple and threatening a stampede. These kinds of poems make the Polish Renaissance a fascinating topic for classicists interested in Neo-Latin literature, or just looking to work on something beyond the green books and the red books of the Loeb Classical Library, and for graduate students in Russian looking to take up a second Slavic language because Russia doesn't have such a developed Renaissance culture. And the Polish Renaissance offers a way as a Slavist to engage with this great movement in European culture. It's also an excellent field for collaboration. Fred Booth learned about Hussovianus from a packet that I sent him from my course at Columbia on the Polish Renaissance and its literature. As a classicist, of course, his Latin was better than mine, and he could recognize many of the classical allusions readily, which I couldn't immediately see without footnotes, while I had access to the Polish criticism, which he was unable to read. And this is often the stumbling block for classicists who want to look into Polish Neo-Latin poetry. Of course, Latinists with such interests may learn Polish, as I studied Latin for my degree in comparative literature, but for those of us in the humanities who tend to work in isolation, this is a great space for collaboration and teamwork. Of course, this was also the era of the Reformation and the rise of vernacular literature, so writers were in fact translated from Latin. Maciej Kazimierz Sarbiewski, who lived from 1595 to 1640, for instance, was so popular for his Latin odes that he was widely translated into English as Casimir Britannicus. He was also author of rhetorical manuals, which we might say marked the beginnings of formal literary study in Poland. One of the most celebrated Polish language poets of this era, aside from Kochanowski, though little of his work remains, is Mikołaj Sęp-Szarzyński, who lived from 1550 to 1581 and built on Kochanowski's sophisticated versification, employing rhymed verse in the form of the Italian sonnet and making frequent use of enjambment or enjambment, if you prefer, or the creation of ambiguity by ending a line in one way and continuing it in a way that is unexpected. And he extends this complex use of poetic language to the metaphysical topics that signal the turn toward the Baroque. Everything in Sęp-Szarzyński is ambiguity and paradox. This is Czesław Miłosz's translation in his History of Polish Literature from sonnet number 5 on the non-durable love of things of this world. It is hard not to love, but no solace is in love. When our thoughts seduced by desire, sweeten those things which must change and decay. Or consider his epitaph to Rome in Anna Zaranko's translation from Anna Nasiłowska's History of Polish Literature, recently translated into English, which I recommend. O pilgrim, you who hope to find Rome within Rome, although you cannot see Rome inside Rome itself, look on the circle of walls and, changed to rubble, on the theaters, temples, and broken columns. These are Rome. Nothing is what it seems in Semp's poetry. Objects function as symbols beyond their immediate physical reference. Decay is everywhere, prefiguring what the European Romantics would take from, say, the English metaphysical poets. Well, we're really just scratching the surface here, but perhaps we'll need to circle back to these Renaissance poets and more, such as the Polish Aesop, Biernat of Lublin, Andrzej Krzycki, a drinker and joker who rises to a high position of power, the great poet and diplomat Jan Dantišek, or Dantiscus, who served and had a second family at the court of Charles V. Klemens Janicki, who was obsessed with fashion and was concerned that his friends considered him too effeminate, although in that era it was normal for fashion to be more of an issue for men than women, I think. Łukasz Górnicki, who wrote a Polish counterpart to Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, or Mikołaj Ray, a Protestant sometimes called the father of Polish literature, who created the image of the old Polish gentleman in his country manner. Before we meet today's guest, I'd like to remind you to subscribe. If you like our series, click the bell to receive notifications about new episodes, and follow our playlist down in the description below to catch up on past episodes. Our guest today, Barry Keane, is professor in comparative studies at the Institute of English Studies at the University of Warsaw. He has written widely in the fields of classical tradition, Irish, particularly James Joyce in recent years, and Scottish literature, and Polish literature. And his book publications include Polish to English translated and critical editions of Renaissance poet Jan Kochanowski, published in 2018, and the Baroque poetess Anna Zaranko, published in 2016, 2021, and one more out due this year for ITER Press. He has also written Irish drama in Poland, staging and reception in 2016 for Intellect Limited, and biographical manuscripts on the Polish Renaissance and the Polish Baroque for Oxford Bibliographies. Barry, after knowing your work for many years, it's great to meet you finally. Thank you for joining us here on Encounters with Polish Literature.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're talking about Jan Kochanowski today. Some people, refer to him as the greatest Slavic poet of the Renaissance. But what constituted the Renaissance in Poland? How did the Renaissance get to Poland?
Well, he's born in 1530, which is kind of more or less the beginnings of the Renaissance, and with kind of some approximation, the golden age of the Polish Renaissance is the entirety of the 16th century. And in many ways, it kind of echoes the instincts of the European Renaissance, where you have writers and scholars, and they receive patronage of perhaps far-seeing mentors, like the far-seeing royal household and maybe political or ecclesiastical power brokers. And these writers would almost inevitably look to forge a vernacular culture and a vernacular language that would draw on both the country's traditions and those of the classical traditions, Greek and Latin. But of course, then you also have, in tandem with that, you have an influx of Italian practitioners who are architects or artists. And they're very much responsible for the fields of art and architecture and the adornment of Poland, yes, the Polish Renaissance. And indeed, if you travel around anywhere in Poland and go to a small town, you see the legacy of this era. The architectural, the beautiful Renaissance squares, the streets, the way small and big towns are designed, and so you go to places like Torun or Gdańsk or Kraków, especially. Zamość. You just see the legacy of the Renaissance, and it really is quite something to behold. And it's wonderful that it's been preserved as well, in spite of all the centuries of upheaval and turmoil and so forth.
And war and conflict. So this is the era of Bona Sforza as Queen of Poland, right?
She's the beginning of it for sure. She brings these Italian artists and of course she has. There's the first guy who kind of makes a big impression in Poland is a guy called Filippo Buonaccorsi, or he's also called Callimachus, and he comes in the late 15th century, and I think he had to flee because of an anti-papal plot. He had to flee Italy, yes. So he's and he finds himself enjoying the patronage of the Bishop of Lwów, this Grzegorz of Sanok, yes, who had himself begun to study, who had studied in Italy. And of course, this idea of the equivalent, the Polish equivalent of the Grand Tour is basically when young men want to be educated and they receive a mentor or a patron and they go to Italy to study. So you get this back and forth of ideas, and he had traveled, and he was responsible, for example, Callimachus, of bringing the works of Boccaccio, for example, and Petrarch, yes, and also the beginnings of Virgil, for example. I think he brings the bucolics, right? So so this relationship between the protector and the supplicant, if you want to say that, yes, becomes a kind of a model for this cultural and scientific patronage, yeah, that begins to. This is the great flourishing of the 16th century. This is the idea, and Kochanowski is very much a product of that. Yes,
right. He is. So why don't we say who was Kochanowski?
Kochanowski is born in a bit of a backwater, but in a very beautiful part of Poland. It's a place called Czarnolas, which is, I suppose, if you want to say Czarny Las, it's like the Black Forest, but of course it's Czarnolas, so it's a name unto itself. And it's not particularly far from Warsaw. It's about, I suppose, a 2-hour drive. And it's a little bit it's a very Arcadian space. It's even if today Czarnolas hasn't really changed, there's not much building there. It's country. It's a country. So he lives in a country manor, and his in relation to where he's actually from, his father was the judge of Sandomierz, another beautiful Renaissance town. And we don't actually know too much about his childhood, to be honest with you. It's a bit like I always compare him a little bit to Shakespeare. We know that he had a local grammar school education, and at the age of 14, he goes to study in Krakow, and he'll stay there for, I think, all of 5 years. He never actually gets a degree. We have a signature for the entry, the matriculation into the university, but he doesn't. We don't have any signature for him having completed. He never did a disputation. He never completed anything. But
he began his studies in Krakow. Yes.
He begins his studies in Krakow, yes, indeed, and but he's a bit of an eternal student, really, yes. So he's 14 to the age of 19, and we assume he's going back and forth to Czarnolas. His parents are basically from around the areas of Zvoleń, Radom, and then Czarnolas Radom is a big city today. They're going to build a big airport there pretty soon, or maybe they already have. And it's between Radom and a beautiful Renaissance town called Kazimierz Dolny, which is on the Wisła, the Vistula River. And yes, so and then he begins a long extended period of time studying in Italy, and most specifically, he's studying in Padua. And that's a very interesting time. He actually he's back and forth from Italy to Poland 3 times, but he's principally all the time in Padua. And Padua is this kind of a center of Renaissance learning. It's where Copernicus studied, so he kind of led the way in that respect. And what is he studying in Padua? Well, he's studying mostly classics. He's studying, and the mode of learning in Padua is translating Greek texts into Latin. So you're going between Greek and Latin. And one of the principal texts they used to translate was a thing called the Plenodian Anthology, which is a series of Greek epigrams. These are collected epigrams. So he's quite clever. He becomes quite a prodigious epigrammist, and also Book 7 of the Plenodian Anthology is exclusively epigrams for the dead, and there's a large part of it is for deceased children. So we'll be coming to that at some point in our discussion. Yes.
Right. So so he's certainly the author of epigrams, fraszki, which are often humorous epigrams, but not all of them. Some of them are, literally this means trifles, but some of it just means they're short sometimes. Yeah,
he makes a reputation initially as a poet of Latin epigrams as well, and Latin poetry. And then over the course, he comes back to Poland and he enjoys the patronship of Bishop Piotr Mieszkowski, who's the Bishop of Kraków, and he's also the secretary to Sigismund Augustus II, who is the king of Poland at the time. He will be the last hereditary king. And then he enjoys this patronage, and he actually also becomes part of the court during the reign of Sigismund Augustus. And it's over this period of time that he does write his very popular pieśni and satyry, and which are satires, yes. And fraszki, which are the trifles, of course.
Let's talk a little bit about what he's most famous for, which is the threne or the threnodies, which are laments about the death of his daughter Urszula. So what's the story here?
Well, yes, he retires to Czarnolas. He probably retires at the age, so he's born 1530, and I think he's 40. So maybe by Renaissance standards, that's getting on to middle to old age. And he settles down with this lady called Dorota Podlodowska, and he has 7 children, 6 girls and 1 boy. And But 2 die, Urszula and Hannah die within a short space of each other. And it's a very unusual response for the time in which he lived, because it's a very emotional response to her death. He really is quite devastated, in fact, by her passing. It's the first passing, Urszula. So this is the literary response. And then you have a post-literary response in a kind of a small epitaph for Hannah. But we can assume that whatever he says about Urszula, he would also apply to Hannah. Yes. So so at the beginning of this set of laments, which you have an epitaph for Urszula, and then at the end you have an epitaph for Hannah. And he writes in response to her death 19 poems. And all of different length, and it goes from a classical response to a classical in the sense of a paganistic response. So he's drawing on consolation literature from ancient Greece and Latin and ancient Rome, the Roman writers, and then he's moving towards a Christian response, which is slightly different. It's got an awful lot more platitudes, and he has to kind of, when we think of our own maybe perhaps Christian beliefs, we take consolation in the idea that someone has gone to heaven and so forth. But in the earlier poems, he is really trying to figure out how it is that he has lost his child, but also how he's lost his balance, his equanimity is the idea. So because he believes in the idea of Stoicism. That was he studied Cicero in Padua, and Cicero is his kind of go-to philosopher. But Cicero also lost his child Tullia, and he talks about the death of his child in the Tusculan Disputations. And these are letters to Marcus Brutus. And in both instances, they're both shocked at the idea that they have such a strong emotional response to the death of their child. And so in a way, he goes through this, I call it grief, anger, and acceptance. So he expresses grief at her death, then he expresses anger at her, and he also expresses for leaving him, and then he has to accept it, because the more you go to the Christian, the Christian outlook on death, you kind of have to accept that this is the way the Lord moves. Yes, and children were taken all the This is a time when child mortality was
high.
Just high. Yes, so, but the idea is that he is in Renaissance times. It was kind of codified by a guy called Julius Caesar Scaliger, that you don't write poetry for kids, for the death of children. You write for a persona gravis, someone worthy of note.
Yes.
But Kochanowski doesn't do that. He generally tends to ignore the prescriptive advice of his contemporaries, and he always looks to the classical world for his inspiration. And one of the most interesting aspects of the threnodies is that he seems to be struggling to find language to express his inexpressible grief. I mean, I was always quite struck by Czesław Miłosz. He criticized Kochanowski for being too much of the classical writer. That the more you draw on classical literature, the less emotional the response is. Yeah. But in fact, the ancients were always looking to express the potentiality of a young person who has died. So they're always looking to what their futures may have been. And I think that's something that's what Kochanowski certainly was thinking about with Ursula. Yes.
So let's look at some of the poems. The most famous one is probably number 8. Do you want to read your translation?
Threnody 8. Ursula, your death has left a void in our home, as your lingering afterglow fills each room. Dear child, our hurt is made worse by the memory of the sweet little soul who brought us such joy. You chattered and sang gaily for all to see, bringing a liveliness to every day. You were as good as gold for your mammy, and you were the twinkle in your daddy's eye. Clasping us both in an endearing embrace, you could warm our hearts with laughter and kisses. Now loss and silence dwell among us here. Gaiety grows distant to memory and ear. From every corner the man is overcome. He grieves, vainly hoping that his sorrow will one day ease.
It comes across as personal. It's but on the other hand, he's applying classical form to something that is very personal emotion, right? I mean, that he's writing in are these 13-syllable rhymed couplets is usually the way that most of these work out.
Yes, well, I mean,
that it seems that one thing that we kind of see in these poems is this this desire to sort of master emotion through reason or something like that, but maybe it's through poetry, maybe it's by putting everything into the so-called Polish Alexandrin, that he can bring these very deep and powerful emotions under control.
Yes, indeed. I mean, in this particular poem, he's a father who reflects upon the house in former days Ursula was alive and well, yes. And there's always this idea of the now, the desolation of the now, and the happiness of the then, of the previous times, yeah? And the contrast is really quite immense, yes. You can almost hear the echoes of silence in the house, yeah?
One thing that I noticed, that I don't want to, there are many translations of these. Of course, the most famous are Shemasini and Stanisław Baranczak. But in this poem, there's an interesting thing I noticed about their translation, is that they start out their translation in the third person. The void, this is just the first 4 lines. The void that fills my house is so immense. Now that my girl is gone. It's, I guess, the first person, but also talking about the third person. It baffles sense. Third person. We, first person plural now, we all are here, yet no one is, I feel. The flight of one small soul has tipped the scale. And then we switch into, in their translation, you talked for all of us. So then we get back to the second person. And second person is something that's always of interest to me, because it's, especially in the classics, used in interesting ways. Like, Homer uses the second person to either address the muse or address the dead, or to address somebody who's about to be dead. So if they're addressed to the third person, but they're still in the second person, but they're still alive, they're probably not going to be alive on the next page. And here, and you've maintained.
Well, they mix it though, yeah. But I mean, the beginning is this wielkieś mi uczyniła pustki w domu moim, yes.
Yeah, and it is second person. Yeah,
it is second person. He's always directing it to her. But I mean, sometimes just that you sometimes hear a line in your mind and you have to kind of go with that, yeah.
Yeah.
So the void that fills my house is so immense that my girl is gone. Yeah, but it's a very nice line anyway. Anyhow,
it's a wonderful line, but it's a wonderful line. But it is like then the question is, where's the apostrophe? Or, I mean, the apostrophe I mean, it makes sense to put it at the beginning, because that's where apostrophe goes, right?
I just if I can read to you, this is a speech by Hecuba in the Iliad, and so this is something just to give you an indication of this idea of now and then, yes? So she says, "Child, oh my misery, why should I live now when I have suffered the agony of your death? Day and night you were there, you were then my pride in the city, and the benefactor of all the men and women throughout Troy." Yes, and so forth and so forth, yes? So, and then she says, "When you were alive, but now death and fate have overtaken you." You see? So this contrast, and you can see this throughout many examples in classical literature, from Homer all the way to the Latin writers, which is really very interesting. And actually, when I was when I wrote the commentary to Laments, which was actually part of my MA thesis. So my MA thesis has followed me around. We were doing Latin classes with a Scottish lecturer. She was a young doctoral student called Margaret King. I hope I remember her. And because it's quite a coincidence, my editor for some of my other books is Margaret King but it's a different Margaret. But she was doing her doctorate on Latin epitaphs, which she had basically gone around Rome, ancient Rome, and was noting down Latin epitaphs pertaining to the death of children. And I was telling her about that. I was doing the Laments so she wasn't my supervisor, but she showed me these Latin epitaphs, and I was really kind of struck by how close they were well, I mean, it's obviously the theme of the death of children, but it's also the language with which parents find to express the death of their child. And in a way, I think it left me feeling that really Kochanowski is tapping into some kind of universal sense of grief, that we all grieve, we all find trials and tribulations in our lives, and we lose our equanimity, and it's particularly terrible if you lose a child, yes,
right.
and sometimes language is just not enough, but he's using classical language, but he's not really talking. It's not really language. He's tapping into the language of consolation, because sometimes if you can't find language to express something, you need to tap into tradition that knows how to deal with it best.
That's a good way of making the case for his use of the classics. Of course, it's also just the era, right? I mean, they're all studying all the sort of poets of that era are studying the classics, and they're immersed in it. And their audience that is interested and able to read this, this kind of poetry is, I think, will understand it, right? I mean, is the audience?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, but what's very interesting as well is that it's not an adorned language. I mean, by the time you get to the Baroque, the language becomes very adorned and quite hard to follow in many instances. But there's a simplicity about the language of Kochanowski. But I think it comes from so it's wrapped up in the language and traditions and the consolatory traditions of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But there's just a reality to his own situation that I think speaks to you when you read the threnody, yeah.
And I think also that use of the second person, I mean, it taps into things that are Slavic as well, right? I mean, that often the comparison is made to the Żale Matki Boskiej Podkrzyżem, the laments
Absolutely.
of the Blessed Virgin before the cross, the Blessed Mother before the cross, where
who speaks?
Where she's gathering her friends around her, and then at the end she speaks directly to Jesus on the cross, where as if it's a personal, a completely personal encounter, and that's maybe something also that the audience understands.
Yes, you're really sparking off ideas in my mind as you say these things. I mean, who speaks directly to their child? In literature so much. Yeah. It doesn't really happen, and I think we're going to read one more. Is that?
Yeah, should we read one or two more? Yeah. So let's look at number 12. Would you like to?
I'd be very honored if you read it.
This is threnody number 12. I feel that no one could have loved a child more or felt the pain that I most ardently bore, for scarcely ever has a child been born more deserving of its parents' place to mourn. She was obedient, unspoilt, a presence grown, her legacy to sing and rhyme as shown. She would mimic every bow and attitude, adept in the arts and wiles of maidenhood. Prudent, decent, humane, never one to whine, confident, well-mannered, modest, shy, mine. Never of a morning would she sit down to breakfast without thanking our Lord for the sumptuous feast, and before sleep she would kneel by the bed, say her prayers, and then kiss her mammy goodnight. Always she would leap and bound out the door whenever she saw me returning from afar. She obliged with every household duty and chore, often anticipating the servant's work and more. In such a way did she behave at the tender age of just 30 months, but an infant stage. The mantle of such virtuousness and bravery bore too heavily upon the little baby. Dead before the harvest, my unique ear of corn had yet to rise, and now I am bereft and forlorn. So I sow your seed once again into the ground, where my hopes with you lie buried and bound. Because never more shall you sprout up or rise or blossom and thrive before my listless eyes.
I feel very moved, actually. Thank you very much for reading that.
It is a very moving poem. I mean, and your translation captures that it's... that feeling of loss, and the idea of she's being sown into the soil when upon her death.
But he's very proud of her. You see, this is the thing, and this was a Senecan consolation. The idea that that almost you blame the mantle of her virtue for her premature death, and I think Seneca wrote. Whatever has reached perfection is near its end. See, so, right. And also on Latin epitaphs, for example, parents would often record great pride in their child. You see, so So
and
here's
30
actually,
months, it seems impossible, right? I mean, could she have done all these things, right? I mean, it's very much a projection into the future, I think. Yeah.
It is, but I mean, what as a parent of a young girl are you projecting in that era,
right,
other than marriage?
Sure.
So he seems to be always projecting things that are not necessarily would be traditional in given the time that in which he lived. Yes. So I think as well, just living in Chardonalas, he creates a little bit of his own reality. He's surrounded by, he's got 6 daughters and a wife, and he has his sisters around as well, I think. And I just think he develops, I hate to use the word feminist because it's a 20th century late kind of idea, but he does seem to develop a very feminist outlook and a very protective outlook with respect to his daughters. He just seems to have been a very kind man as well. There's not really any, there's nothing, everything about him suggests a kind of a generosity of spirit. Can I just read out this one of these Latin epitaphs to give you some context?
Please, yeah.
So, and again, thank you to Margaret King for giving this to me. So here we are. By a wretched destiny, here lies Antonius Severus Aquila without a soul. He lived 12 years and 6 months, who prayed that he should have provided these things for his parents. But untimely death ensured that the parents did this for their son. I loved my studies, was obedient to my teachers, observed the precepts of my parents, cultivated my friends, patrons, all good men, was ready in duty, but with destined time of life, they brought too much grief. And this is a 12-year-old who's actually on the cusp of manhood, but he's actually applying these same ideas to his 30-month-old.
Yeah, and he's imagining that she's, in number 6, that she's going to be the Slavic Sappho, that she's going to inherit his ability as a poet, right? That's part.
Yes,
of her,
at a time when there weren't that. Yes, but at a time when there were no female poets to speak of. Yes, they do come along in the 17th century, but yeah. But these are unpublished manuscripts. They're basically writing for themselves. Yeah. So
right.
But he seems to even the idea that he's expressing professional ambitions for his 30-month-old daughter.
Can we also look at maybe threnody number 15, which starts out, "O golden-haired Erato and gracious lute." So this is like another apostrophe, another a direct address, but this time to the muse, to the gods, to calling for poetry. Where can grief-stricken people find comfort? But also the myth brings in the myth of Niobe.
Well, Niobe is a very important motif in Thren, and she appears in Thren number 4, or the threnody number 4, and in this particular threnody 15. Niobe is, we may remember, she was the mother of 6 children, 6 girls and 6 boys, and she boasts to the gods of that no one has produced such a progeny. And of course, Leto, the goddess, is not happy about this, and she's just had 2 children, Apollo and Artemis, she's produced 2 gods that really should be enough for her, but you're not supposed to boast. You're not supposed to boast before the gods, and she orders Apollo and Artemis to kill the children. So Artemis takes a bow and arrow to the girls, and Apollo takes a bow and arrow to the boys. And she turns to stone. She petrifies, and she becomes emblematic of grief. "O golden-haired Erato and gracious lute, where can grief-stricken people find comfort? Just for a short time, soothe my afflicted mind, so I'll not stand in a field, a stone pillar in kind, shedding near bloody tears through sentient marble, a monument to grief, a hapless symbol. Am I wrong? Or does pondering man's wretched state help us to understand our own tragic fate? Poor luckless mother, should we chastise fortune when it is we who have abandoned reason? Where's your crop of 7 girls and 7 boys? Where's your solace, your occasion to rejoice? I see 14 graves, and you, wholly wretched, apparently alive, but wishing for death, embracing the cold graves just to think on your pain, laying your poor children to rest so cruelly slain. So it is when flowers lie stricken, lopped by a scythe, or are flattened by a downpour onto their side. What hope can you ever have? What more is there? Why don't you put an end to all your despair? With your bows and arrows you displayed your prowess, always straight and true, O Phoebe and vengeful goddess. Such was her guilt, you may strike from pity or rage, put an end to her pitiful old age. The dread torment intended for Niobe alone, so crying for her children she was turned to stone. A deathless rock and Sipylus, a fixed relief, her hardcore swelling from her inner grief. Niobe's tears seep through the rock's porous seam, flowing down the mountainside, a sparkling stream for animals and the birds to drink. Niobe remains, a rock beaten upon the winds, herself in bonds. This tomb holds no corpse, this corpse is held by no tomb, but in essence and of itself is corpse and tomb. There's one thing I think is very important, just as we think of the legacy of Trene, it does put the child at the center of the narrative, which is unusual in literature, and it remains so up until the end of the 19th century. We really think of for example, for me, when I think of children in early children's literature, these are always children that are displaced, unloved, and we can think of, for example, the Little Match Girl. Mm-hmm. We can think of the chimney sweep Blake. Mm-hmm. We even can think of the Baker Street Boys or the Lost Boys of Never Neverland. Kids are always just orphans or rejected and so forth. And really, the concept of a happy childhood is a pretty late modern concept. Mm-hmm. And yet, this child is the center of Kochanowski's attentions and love. Yeah, mm-hmm. And I just think it preempts quite a lot of. The centuries, it takes many centuries for other people to catch up with this notion. Yes.
I'm also thinking again about these various editions and translations that we have that reveal different layers. And I think yours is the only one that has this extensive commentary that shows this what the classical sources are, which we can find in perhaps the Biblioteka Narodowa edition, in Polish. But for our audience, people who are maybe reading in English or who are learning Polish, mm-hmm. And need to know that background in order to understand the poems, this is very valuable. This kind of edition that explicates these classical sources in English, but it's very hard to find this edition. I mean, are there any kind of prospects for republication, or
watch this space? Watch this space.
Okay,
that's all I can say. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've been so busy doing some other writing, some other books the last couple of years that have received a certain prominence that I haven't returned, and it's really just maybe people like yourself who remind me that this is something I once did, and it has value. It has value, and maybe I should return to it. Yeah, I think as well in relation to the commentary. I'll always thank my education in Trinity College. It was suggested to me that would be a very good way of supplementing my translation, would be with a commentary as opposed to an essay. So, mm-hmm. And I've gone on to write several commentaries to different works, and it's something I enjoy very much. And I think it also reflects my, I put it this way, I don't translate that much, but when I do, it has to be a bit of a journey, something that speaks to me. And I generally accompany my translations with a commentary, because I think it reflects my journey very much. And it's how mm-hmm. It's my own interaction with the with the work, because it's not really enough just to say, oh, he's taken it from that or he's taken it from this, and you can find an equivalent. You have to offer context as well, and interpretation. And so, I mean, when you've asked me to go on this show, I started reading my commentaries, and they almost gave me as much pleasure as reading my translations, to be honest. Okay. So thank you very much for your compliments, and I will do my very best.
There are editors who sometimes watch this program, and I like to point out things that are due for republication, or for sometimes we discuss works that have never been translated, and things that need to be translated.
No, but I did them when I was very young. I mean, I'm 52 now, and I actually wrote these two works when I was 22 now, between 21 and 23. Mm-hmm. And I think people were a bit incredulous that I had done them. Actually, I'd written them at such a young age. But I did return to the threnodies about about 10 years ago. I just, maybe as a father, or maybe I was just a bit older, and I did redo them. I had a second crack at them. And so that's the result is what I've been reading today. And, maybe I have a father's voice in the translations, a bit of my own thing, I suppose. Yeah, but
that happens. It
happens. But I think that's important. But I mean, you're supposed to intersect with someone that you spend. I've spent several years in Kochanowski, and the intersection it would almost be incredible if there wasn't some emotional intersection. Yeah,
I think so. I think so. Yeah, and these translations are quite different from the earlier ones from 2001, which I happen to have. So I was. They're really rethought, and they're
but they're still close to that. But one of the things I always tried is that they still have to be close to the classical sources upon which they're based.
Yeah.
So I mean, and I am, so I'm trying to be faithful. I hate that word, but faithful to two things. So the Polish version, but I actually know the intertextual context of the poems as well. So, I mean, you don't stray too far, but, there has to be a personal story. And I suppose, I was just someone who was kind of unknown. And Kochanowski really, I suppose, I discovered him at such a young age, and I was almost discovering Polish as well at the same time as writing. So I think it was just due a second look. Mm-hmm. But I don't think I'd do it a third look. I think they're I'm quite happy. I'm quite happy with as they are. Yes.
Eventually you have to decide you're done.
No, you just have to leave it alone at some point. Yeah.
And let it go.
You never really feel ownership over things you translate, though, especially things like Kochanowski when it's been translated by other people. Yes. So you never feel you have that sense of ownership of what you've done. It's always in relation to what someone else has done, which sometimes can be a little bit unsatisfactory, but that's just the nature of things, I suppose.
So let's look at this other famous drama that Kochanowski wrote, The Dismissal of the Grecian Envoys. A very curious work, because I'd forgotten that this was written for the wedding of Jan Zamoyski. It's like, it's a political discourse. I mean, it doesn't seem...
It's not what you'd expect for a wedding. It's like dessert, but with pepper, added to it. Yeah, he didn't even attend that wedding. It's a tragedy without a victim, but the victim is potentially Poland beyond the curtain. The Trojans are about to have an assembly to decide whether to give Helen back to the Greeks or not. And this assembly takes place in Book 7 of Homer. And of course, they really should give her back. It's the best thing to do, but and King Priam's advisor is Antenor, and he's an elderly Trojan And he absolutely feels appalled by the presence of Helen in Troy. And so they're about to have an assembly. Basically, so the king is not going to make this decision on his own whether to give her back. He's going to have an assembly, which is very similar to a Polish parliament, and he's going to ask the assembly to take a vote on it. But of course, there are going to be various speeches for and against. And Antenor will make a speech saying, give her back. And whereas Paris Alexander, who has taken Helen, will say, no, I think she should stay. And what are the arguments? Well, the arguments are that the Greeks came over to Colchis in the previous generations, like Jason and the Argonauts, and they stole Medea. So it's fine for me to go over to Sparta and take Helen. And this kind of whips up a certain warlike cry to take on the Greeks, even though they know it's a doomed undertaking. And so Antenor is a very unusual choice to be the hero of this tragedy, because Antenor in tradition is the particular person who opened the gates of Troy for the Greeks. So in other words, he's a traitor in waiting. Mm-hmm. And but Homer never says this. These are later traditions. But unfortunately, Homer was not particularly popular in medieval times. And there were other accounts of the Trojan War written specifically by two Latin writers, Dares and Dictes. And these would be the equivalent, I suppose, in American political parlance of these guys are offering, what is it called? Alternative facts, right? They basically say, writing in Latin, that they were there, okay, even though Bronze Age Hittite vassal kingdom didn't have Latin for a start, anyhow. Yeah. So yes, but Antenor, as a result of this tradition, is to be found in Dante's Inferno with the traitors such as Judas, right? He's a pretty bad one. Brutus, he's another one. And there's Antenor, who's opened the gates of Troy. Kochanowski makes him a hero. Why? Because he's always making this allusion back to Homer. So he's creating a link. He believes Homer, and he doesn't believe the intermediate accounts of the Trojan War. So, and of course, Antenor actually was hosted Odysseus and Menelaus when they come as envoys. So this is the Greek envoys. They stand before this assembly of Trojan nobility, and they say, give Helen back, or else we're going to come here and we're really going to, wreck the place, right? And
we're going to bring a lot of ships.
Well, we're going to bring a lot of ships, and we're going to bring a guy called Achilles, and it's really not going to end well for any of you, yeah? So, but Antenor, as a result of he hosts Menelaus and Odysseus during their time in Troy. So he is offering the kind of hospitality that Paris has rejected when a guest in Menelaus's house. Mm-hmm. So there's this particular Greek word called xenia, which is the agreement for strangers to become friends. In other words, it's the law of hospitality. So we know that Paris has broken that law of hospitality. Not only does he bed Helen, but he also takes her back with him, yes?
Yeah.
Whereas Antenor is the epitome of a hospitable host. And for that reason, according to traditions, he is allowed to survive the sack of Troy. So there are two Trojans who survived the sack of Troy. You've got Aeneas and you've got Antenor. Aeneas will go on to found Rome. Mm-hmm. Antenor founds Padua, where Kochanowski studies. So it's a very interesting. Kochanowski makes biographical and literary connections, and it's a fascinating play.
And that explains his sympathy for Antenor. right? Because
it does. It does. But it's just his choice. He's always moving away from contemporary judgments. I mean, Dante would have been a singular authority for centuries, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like making Judas a hero of your play. Yeah. That's the equivalent. And yet he does make Antenor the hero of his play.
Yeah, and it's pretty radical.
It's pretty radical. It's not radical to us today, but it might have been radical at the time. And the thing is, so the Trojan assembly get whipped up into this, we can take the Greeks on. And of course, we all know what countries that get into this war mode, they can't really you can't reverse the trend. Yeah, you get.
Mm-hmm.
And very few countries that have ever put themselves on a war footing have not gone through it even though it's national suicide. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is the case with this play. So the Trojans decide to keep her and send Menelaus and Odysseus on their way, and we know what the fate of Troy is. And of course, Poland also things begin to unravel a little bit quite a lot in the 17th century, beginning with the Swedish deluge. And so people have always said that it's a national tragedy because it seems to predict just the way the corruption of the nobility, the inability to establish clear policies, also, and this lends itself to this, in a sense, destabilizes the nation. Yeah. And so that's the tragedy. The tragedy is beyond the curtain.
Yes, this is the reason to do it at the wedding is because, of course, the most important, nobles and members of the Schlachta, the gentry, will be there. So here he has a chance to make a kind of political statement.
A captive audience.
Yes, that they are.
Who have probably, have drunk a bit and are maybe pliable to some ideas. Yeah.
They could be. Do you want to read the opening scene?
I think we could.
It has long been anticipated and loudly proclaimed that such an affront compounded by dishonesty will not be suffered by the valiant Greeks. At this very moment, we have their envoys here, demanding from us that Helen be returned to those from whom she was snatched by Alexander, whom not long ago, as a guest in Greece of vile infidelity, stole Helen from her husband and brought her over the boisterous sea. If into the arms of the husband we yield her up, we may yet rest easy. But if with nothing the messengers depart, this very day we shall hear news of the Greeks landing and making war upon our soil. I see Alexander is conspiring to take care of his problem. He gathers a company and presents them with keepsakes. So he's paying bribes to the members of the assembly. But he hasn't got past me. As for me, my home and all that I have from my ancestors, one cannot sell. If I should have the intention to bring my virtue to the market, may the Lord God intervene. One cannot trust the justice of a man who takes gold to deliver a speech. He who allows the collapse of his society, does he think he will remain untouched when everything has fallen down around him? But for me, it is time to give counsel. Today, the king is to receive the envoys. Is it true? Do I see Alexander? Yes, indeed, it is he.
So this is Alexander Paris.
Yes, scene one.
Enter Alexander. As almost all have so far given me their allegiance, worthy Antenor, I beg you, take my part against the envoys.
If it pleases you, worthy prince, to support any just decision that will further the good of our nation.
You have but to listen when a friend asks.
I give consent when the right thing is asked for.
To wish more for a stranger than an acquaintance, it seems to me something not far from jealousy.
Friendship more than wanting to serve truth? It lies contrary to honesty.
Hand washes hand, but supports foot. Friend gives haven to friend.
truly a great friend that would be, compulsion is not friendship.
It is in adversity, they say, that one discovers true friendship.
The conscience pays for such a necessity.
A noble conscience to stand by our friend.
Even nobler to stand by the truth.
Does truth to you consist in helping the Greeks?
I help the righteous, Greek or no.
I see that you would judge me hastily.
One's conscience must judge everybody.
It is known that you are entertaining the Greeks.
To all honest men, my home is open.
Especially to those who do not come with empty hands.
Unlike some, I don't have to bribe the judges because I took another man's wife, about whom they judge.
I don't know about judgment or wives. I don't know anything about judgment or wives, but you obviously prefer to accept gifts from Greeks especially. Mine are too insignificant for you.
I accept no gifts or wives or anything else. As for you, I can see you are as you live and you speak recklessly. I will have no truck with you.
I regret asking anything of you. In my gods I will trust. Without your gracious approval, I will find support for my affairs.
From some other like you, no doubt.
God willing, a kindly man. Isn't that great?
That is great.
It's really good. That's called an agonic dialogue. It's called in Greek tragedy. So that means a competitive dialogue. So where one character tries to get one up on the other. Yes. So they so it's a very interesting, and it really does set the tone for what follows. Yeah.
It does, and it establishes that Antenor rather is on the seems to be by all accounts on the right side, that he's being neutral, and it's kind of a lesson that he's delivering to these Polish nobles that well, first of all, think about the truth, think about what's the right thing to do before paying bribes, and one hand washes the other, and all this corruption that he sees happening in the background.
Yeah, and what we know in history, it's not always easy to fall in with the truth, is it?
No.
So, and there are certain pressures that just build up, and you just kind of have to go along with current thinking, even though it's not the right way to go. Yeah. So yeah,
it's
very interesting.
And the play is on this reading. This time I looked. I mean, I think the first time I read it, I was saying, well, maybe what he's trying to say to the nobles is that it's important for the king to obey the parliament, because that's what happens. That the king says, well, I don't necessarily agree with this, but this is what the parliament decided, and we live in this gentry democracy of the gentry, as they called it. Poland was at the time one of the most democratic countries in Europe because the gentry was so large and such a large portion of the population. So that even if he doesn't accept the result, the king has to go along.
The Polish Sejm had this idea of all agreeing. It's either everyone agrees or no one agrees. So and it became this idea of the liberum veto. So you could actually interrupt the passing of legislation or the passing of an act until everyone else kind of came with you. So it's and that's what we see in this play for sure. I think a very interesting voice for war is spoken by Hikatean in this parliamentary debate. And so, when the Greeks ask us to jump, shall we ask how high? They order us to be afraid of them, and I, of course, am afraid. Now they order us to give back Helen. Following this, they will claim our wives and children. Their lust for power has no limits, as when a river bursts its banks and the fields are flooded. Lords, we too must arm ourselves, because it will be too late when the collar is fitted to our necks. They cry justice and threaten us with war. Give by your own free will, or I will wrest her back by force. The matter is plain. I am committed to justice, but not at the expense of my honor. No one would take her from me if he wanted both my prostration and my suffering. It is an old Greek title by which they called themselves lord, and others foreign to their land, barbarians or servants. But whether one is born in the Peloponnese or Troy, a sharp sword through the side will show who begs on his knees for mercy. So far, the Greek has been equal to it. But let him know that he is not as dangerous as he thinks. If the taking of Helen by Alexander was so wrong, let them show first how to repay such an outrage, as it was they themselves who first performed such a crime, albeit Alexander didn't take brother with sister, like they took Medea and Absyrtus. And Tenor says that it is not our affair. I say it is. For one person hurt, they all took up arms. Will they be so singularly laid them down? I don't think so. A neighbour gives aid to a neighbour, in Asia as in Europe. It was always spoken of and will be spoken of to the very end. As to the issue regarding the king's sister and the old demand, the hurt deserves a higher forum than we can provide. Remember the weight of the thrust of the sword. I am thinking of noble Trojan blood. It is yet to be avenged. And so I do not advise restoring Helen until they come to terms with us about Medea. There is Absyrtus is Medea's brother, and right. He was, so when Jason was running from Aeetes, the king of Colchis, she would chop him up into pieces, and Aeetes would have to collect the pieces of his son, and that's what delayed. That's what allowed the Argonauts to escape. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting. In the Colchis is supposed to be an ally of Troy, so it's very much a war of alliances. Just in the way you have the Greek alliance, it's not just Sparta going to war with Troy; it's all the city-states. Mm-hmm. But also Troy has its own collection of city-states as well.
Would you call this speech, a kind of a demagoguery? I mean, that he's...
Oh, this is demagoguery. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that he's definitely like, creating fear, in the Trojans, and maybe, where does this fit into the situation where he's speaking to the Poles already at this point? Hasn't Russia like retaken a portion of Polish territory? Or
this is the time of Ivan IV,
right?
And there is a dispute in Livonia. At the end of the play, there's also, I think, Kochanowski also presented a poem called Orpheus Sarmaticus. So, and that's about a warning about taking on about going to war. It's not about not going to war. It's about going to war when it's justified, and are you prepared to go to war? And this is so the justification for war in this instance is dubious, to say the least. But it's amazing where rhetoric can bring you as a nation, yeah? And so this is certainly Hikitaean is a very interesting example of the kind of modern day demagoguery that we are all having to deal with today, yes?
In many different places.
I say that with a laugh, but I'm not really laughing, yes?
No. And of course, we never quite figure out what Helen wants in all of this.
Well, we do and we don't, because she never really revealed. It's a very interesting. She actually gives two speeches, one on fortune, and she gives another speech about her particular situation, and she never really reveals which side she's on, which is also taps into the tradition of Helen that, does she want to stay in Troy, or does she want to go back to her husband, and she's always hedging her bets. Yes, so. And very interestingly, when she hears news of the decision by the Trojan Council to that she will stay, she doesn't say very much. Soon after the decree, the envoys were sent for, and I in turn was sent to you with the news that you have just heard. Your husband is at home waiting for you. Of course, this is Alexander Paris, so we must not delay. You speak well, lead and I shall follow. So. And the chorus then reacts to this. This is just as she thought. It does not bode well with me. Whether she feels joy or sorrow, I do not know. The envoys go forth with long faces. It seems that the council did not take their part. All very interesting. It's a great play.
It is, and so she does it. Yeah, well, it does seem, but that's maybe the best she can do because she doesn't have control in this situation, right? I mean, the best she can do is to hedge her bets so that it doesn't come out poorly for her, one way or the other.
Yeah, well, I mean, but again, Kochanowski particularly in the longer speech by Helen, he does intertwine various aspects of the tradition of Helen, which I discuss in the commentary. So, it really is a very interesting. So, is she the victim? So, the idea is that she might blame Aphrodite, for example, for her actions. And what could she do anyway? Wasn't she the gift promised by Aphrodite? So she's the passive victim in this. Yeah. So
we've already spoken about interest in perhaps republishing Kochanowski, but what else are you working on these days?
Well, I do seem to be interested in people who lament their lives. So I've been working on a woman poet who wrote in the late 17th century, Anna Zaranko, and she was married to three husbands, but she's the first one is she marries a guy who's particularly ugly and is so disturbed that he fails to consummate the marriage. So she calls him Aesop. So he's the first husband, and that's the first episode. So it's an epic poem of her three marriages. Mm-hmm. So, but it was so long, I divided it. I actually just undertook the idea to divide it into three books. And so the first one is called the Aesop episode. And then her second husband is a cavalier called Jan Olesnicki, and he dies of illness following the Battle of Chochim in today's Ukraine. He was Jan Sobieski's captain. And then her third husband dies as a result of wounds and after in the Battle of Vienna. In 1683. So it's a very epic story, and two books have come out. I'm very happy they were published in America, and the third and final the episode, The Third Husband, is going to come out next year. So, and that's kept me very busy.
I'm sure.
So,
yeah. So we'll look forward to reading the full Transakcja of Anna Stanisławska.
Thanks very much.
Yes. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me on the program.
That was lovely. I really had a great time talking to you, and I certainly hope to make an appearance again at some time in the future.
We'll have to do it for Stanisławska when the next volume comes out.
Fantastic.
Yo, hold up. Please subscribe and click the bell to stay on top of the program. Watch the credits for some recommendations about how you can support aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing war in their country. I'd like to thank, again, all of the people who helped make this series possible. The Polish Cultural Institute New York sponsors our program. Bartek Remisko, head of Humanities and Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, is our executive producer. Natalia Iudin has been my fellow producer and editor for these 50 episodes. Our opening and closing music is by Radek Przedpełski. Thank you all for listening and reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month when we'll be moving on to the Enlightenment for a discussion of Ignacy Krasicki's Voltairean novel, The Adventures of Mr. Nicholas Wisdom. See you then.
Jest to szary dzień, jak zawsze w tej okolicy. Cała sceneria wydaje się chwilami fotografią z ilustrowanej gazety. Tak szare, tak płaskie są domy, ludzie i pojazdy.